wanted to do, and I'm going to admit this, even though I didn't agree with a lot of their policy prescriptions, I was sympathetic to it. What the old left wanted to do is they wanted to take that money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and redistribute it to poor people for the benefit of poor people. That's what the Occupy Wall Street movement was in part all about. But there was the birth of a new strand of the left right around the same time, right around the time that the United States elected Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, to office, right around 2008, when many millennials were coming of age, exiting college, entering the workforce. There was a birth of a new strand of the left, a new woke left, who said that the real problem wasn't quite economic injustice. It wasn't quite poverty, no. It was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And I'll tell you what, that actually presented the opportunity of a generation for big business in this country. Because if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street is a pretty difficult pill to swallow. But this new woke stuff was actually pretty easy. You applaud diversity and inclusion. You put some token minorities on your boards. You muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to Davos, as you heard about earlier today. This is actually a pretty good game. Good work if you can get it. The big banks and big business in this country were happy to lend not just their money, but their legitimacy to this new woke movement. But they did not do it for free. They had an implicit expectation that the new left in this country effectively look the other way when it came to leaving their own corporate power structure intact. And so that's the story of how a bunch of woke millennials got in bed with a bunch of big banks. Together, they birthed woke capitalism and used that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. And that worked out so well for the banking industry on the back of the ire falling out of the 2008 financial crisis that their friends in Silicon Valley on the other coast decided to get in on the act. What Silicon Valley did was they recognized that the biggest threat to Silicon Valley's monopoly power actually used to come from the left. So what they recognized is that the birth of this new woke left presented yet another opportunity for them. They realized that if they could leverage their corporate power to advance the values of that new strand of the left, the neo-progressive left, then they could effectively get them to look the other way when it came to leaving their own monopoly power intact. And again, that trade worked masterfully for both sides, censoring content or moderating in their language content that new woke left wanted to see online. Get it off the internet, but don't do it for free. You effectively expect that your old enemies look the other way when it comes to leaving your monopoly intact. That's the story of how this new game is played. It is an arranged marriage. It is not an arranged marriage of love, however. It is more like mutual prostitution, and the net result of that act was the illegitimate birth of what I call the woke industrial complex, a force that is far more powerful than either big government or big business alone, because it is a hybrid of the two that together can do what neither one can do on its own. A force far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago. A force far more powerful than our own founding fathers envisioned 250 years ago when they put in place a system of constitutional checks and balances through a three-party system of government that did not envision a fourth branch of government that operated outside of constitutional constraints to be able to do through the back door what government could not do directly through the front door. And those trades worked so well for Silicon Valley and for Wall Street that the rest of corporate America then got in on the act. That's how you get to Coca-Cola issuing new statements about a voting law in Georgia that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer, or teaching its employees how to be less white, as they did earlier this year, to avoid a conversation about their own product's impact on the nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity, which, as you guessed, probably affects the black community that they profess to care so much about disproportionately. It's the story of how Nike criticizes slavery 250 years ago in this country without reducing its own reliance on slave labor today to source $250 sneakers from China that they sell to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. That is how this new game is played. Now, I have some further bad news for you about that arranged marriage, is that in recent years, it went from being a two-party affair into becoming a three-party affair. The third actor who showed up on the scene is none other than the Communist Party of China itself. See, China actually understood this game far more deeply than any of us did. What they recognized was that they could use this new arranged marriage between the woke left and the big business interests in the United States to their own advantage, to turn that into a geopolitical tool to advance their own interests in ways that we actually barely managed to understand as it played out before our own eyes. There's even a Chinese word for wokeness, baizuo. It literally refers to woke left, white progressives in the United States, and they use it to laugh at us. But even worse, they are using it purposefully to undermine our geopolitical standing on the global stage. If you have any doubt about that, I'd encourage you to listen really carefully to what they're saying. Xi Jinping last year is pressed by the EU on the Uyghur human rights crisis in Xinjiang, where they have literally over 1 million Uyghurs locked up, enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse. And the first thing that comes out of Xi Jinping's mouth is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. Now, that's not an accident, because his top diplomat then comes here earlier this spring to the Alaska summit and lectures us for 15 minutes in his opening statement about the fact that China wants to see the U.S. stop slaughtering Black Americans, and that China wants to see the U.S. do better on human rights. Xi Jinping then comes back to the UN General Assembly just a month and a half ago, addresses the UN General Assembly, according to his Chinese translator at least, using the word equity and inclusion innumerable times in his address. This would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that our own corporations here are lending him implicit credibility when they relentlessly criticize the United States without saying a peep about China. Take Disney. Just earlier this year, thank you. You take Disney earlier this year, or actually in this case, 2 years ago, Disney says in the state of Georgia, it will not shoot a film if Georgia passes the equivalent of a heartbeat bill, a new anti-abortion statute. Yet just last year, Disney goes to the Xinjiang province of China, literally ground zero of the Uyghur human rights crisis, the epicenter of the enslavement of over 1 million religious minorities on account of their faith alone, and shoots Mulan there, and does not say a peep until the very end of the film, where they finally muster up the courage, you can see it in the film's credits today, that we thank the local CCP authorities for allowing us the privilege of filming here, including the very authorities that are responsible for enslaving over 1 million Uyghurs. The NBA works the same way, criticizing the U.S. while expanding in China. Just a couple of years ago, Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets dared to tweet, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And the first person to come to China's public defense was none other than my fellow Ohioan, LeBron James, who actually defended China and denounced Daryl Morey for daring to stand with Hong Kong. That is how this new game is played. And you might ask yourself why it is that these corporations and their crony celebrities do it. The answer is actually quite simple. It comes down to money. Because if you're a company here in the United States and you want to enter the Chinese market, the CCP builds a great Chinese wall that prevents you from entering the Chinese market if you criticize the CCP. But they roll out the red carpet if you criticize the United States. So companies are doing what you would expect companies to do, whatever allows them to make the most money. Now, I know you heard earlier today in the 4 o'clock lecture about stakeholder capitalism. Well, one of the origins of stakeholder capitalism actually traces back to a different philosophy in the 1990s, one of democratic capitalism, yet another philosophy that thought we could use capitalism as a vehicle to spread democracy. According to the tenets of democratic capitalism, we could use capitalism as our vehicle to spread democracy to places like China. This was a dominant way of thinking in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party for much of the 1990s, by the way. Well, what China realized is they could turn that game on its head. We thought we could send Big Macs and Happy Meals to places like China, and somehow that was going to spread democracy. We thought we could use our money to get them to be more like us. What they realized is actually they could play the game back in reverse with a vengeance. They could use their money to get us to be more like them. Or even one step better, realize that they could use our money to get us to be more like them. Send back Nike movies and Disney sneakers as Trojan horses to undermine the United States from within. And I use that analogy intentionally. The Battle of Troy was not won militarily. The walls of Troy were impenetrable to the Greek onslaught for a very long time until they realized they could use the gift of the Trojan horse to ultimately undermine Troy from within. And we here in the United States have accepted the Trojan horse of global capitalism that includes an autocratic regime that's playing by the rules of the jungle while we're here pretending like we're participating in a seminar at Yale, that to recognize that they have used our own companies to be able to create a false moral equivalence between the United States and China. Because when you have that new class of international moral arbiters, Disney, the NBA, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, Nike, Airbnb, the list goes on. When you have that new class of international moral arbiters who relentlessly criticize the United States, who are known to criticize injustice, but never criticize the actual macro-aggressions abroad, in contrast to the microaggressions here at home, you attack our greatest geopolitical asset of all. That is not our nuclear arsenal. It is our moral standing on the global stage.